We're doing it.
All right. So we are on chapter 22,
632.
page 632. And we're talking about plant cells and tissues. Are you recording this?
Yeah, I'm recording, bro.
Sweet.
Nothing?
Why are you turning the light on?
What are you talking
We're
about?
trying the camera.
Because
I think
he
we
hasn't
need
started
a little
yet.
more light. Could you in the back pull these open? You can get a little more light.
I got it. Oh, God.
Uno mas.
Not too far.
Okay, why don't you?
Bert said he'd do me a solid.
Okay.
You just walk over.
Let's talk about plant cells. Now, this is we already studied plant cells, and this is a single plant cell. And we already studied all the cell parts. That was way back in chapter 6, I think, or
Like
7,
5th grade?
something like that. Chapter 7.
7.
And so you should know about the plant cell and all of its parts. But plant cells actually come in 3 types. And they have funny names: parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma.
That's not going to be.
3 basic types of plant cells. The most basic is called parenchyma. Let's see how that's really pronounced.
Parenchyma cell. A parenchyma cell is a spherical, thin-walled cell found throughout most plants that can function in photosynthesis, gas exchange, protection, storage, and tissue repair and replacement.
Woohoo!
Well said.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Basically, when you look at a parenchyma cell, it just looks like a normal cell. Here's a parenchyma cell inside of a root or a stem. Notice it doesn't have any chloroplasts in it. Here's a parenchyma cell in a leaf, and all the little green dots you see are chloroplasts that make food for the cell. But these are just normal cells that you see in plants. If you're ever wondering which type of cell a plant cell is, it's probably a good guess to guess parenchyma. Parenchyma is just a normal cell. They can do all sorts of things, store things, do photosynthesis. Collenchyma cells are a little bit different. Often are elongated and occur in long strands or cylinders that provide support for the surrounding cells. Collenchyma cells. And if you look at the cells, these down here are parenchyma cells. You see how they're just normal looking, kind of circular cells. But these are collenchyma cells, and if you'll notice, there's dark areas. The dark areas are thick parts of their cell walls, where their cell walls have gotten thick. And the thickness provides extra support for the plant. Support meaning it makes it tougher in those areas. I'm reading from the book here on page 633. If you have eaten celery, you might be familiar with collenchyma cells. These cells make up those long strings that you can pull from a celery stalk. You know those things they sometimes get in your teeth? The long strands in celery? Those are collenchyma cells. And they're extra tough. They supply extra support. And they make up these long tubes that move water through the vascular tissues. Collenchyma cells. Also provide flexibility. You can bend the celery a bit without breaking it. Of course, if you bend it too far, it will break.
So is the collenchyma the white part or the black part?
The collenchyma cell, the white and the black together are collenchyma cells. The white is the inside of the cell. The black is the cell wall of the cell. So these cells have real thick cell walls, and they look black. Good question.
Thanks.
And then there's sclerenchyma cells, and sclerenchyma cells have even thicker cell walls. And they're dead.
Oh.
Plant cells that lack cytoplasm and other living components when they mature, leaving thick, rigid cell walls. So in a sclerenchyma cell, the cell itself is dead. It's just a space. And the stuff around it is the thick cell wall. It's real thick and hard. And it makes up the hardest structures of plants. Sclerenchyma cells are plant cells that lack cytoplasm and other living components. Their thick, rigid cell walls remain. These cells provide support for a plant, and some are used for transporting materials within the plant. Sclerenchyma cells make up most of the wood we use for shelter, fuel, and paper products. You ever see that the outside covering of a nut is real hard? You ever try a pecan? You ever been eating pecans and get part of the shell there and chew on it? It's real hard and nasty. That's sclerenchyma cells. Really hard. Often used for support or transport. They form these dead cells can help form hollow tubes for transport. So basically, these three types of cells, parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma, they vary in the thickness of their cell walls and how tough they are. Sclerenchyma is the toughest, parenchyma is just normal. Okay? Next page, 634. Exciting, isn't it? Plants are exciting.
Oh, very exciting.
Tomorrow's a little more exciting. I'll show you the biggest plant in the world.
A red.
Show you the biggest leaf in the world. It's an exciting day. Okay, now we're talking about tissues. What happens is plant cells come together to make plant tissues. Tissues are made of many layers of cells. And there are 4 different types of plant tissues that we have to talk about. Meristematic, dermal, vascular, ground. You need to memorize those. Look, 4 choices, multiple choice test. You see how that works? Meristematic, dermal, vascular, and ground. Those are the 4 types of plant tissues. Tissues are made from cells coming together. Now I'm going to explain the 4 types. You ready? First, meristematic. Meristematic cells are regions of rapidly dividing cells. Have you ever heard stem cells?
Yes.
The word stem cells, that's meristematic cells. Stem is kind of short for meristematic. Cells that multiply very quickly and can become anything. And we have different types of stem cells. We have apical meristems, intercalary meristems, and lateral meristems, which I'll show you. Apical meristems are located at the tip of the root and at the tip of the stem. They're cells at the very ends of the plants, and they're multiplying like crazy. And it causes, if the cells multiply, if here we have 1 cell and it multiplies into 2, one of the new cells is higher than where they were before. And so if each of those keeps dividing, it causes growth upward. You see what I'm saying? Stay with me, Graham. You look like you might be falling asleep. Up late playing video games?
Oh, yeah.
Back here, Drew. So, the apical meristems are cells that are constantly multiplying to cause growth of the plant up and down.
Question.
Yes?
The apical meristem, is that visible to like the human eye, or is it like really small?
It's really small. It's microscopic.
But like them all built up on the plant, can you see that? When they're all built up, like the top and the bottom, can you see it?
I mean, you can see the top of the plant. It just looks like a green tip.
Okay.
but to look at the cell structure, you'd have to get a microscope. And here's a microscopic view of the cell structure of a root. And here we see the cells that are the apical meristem. And they're just constantly multiplying, and it makes the root grow downward. Now, there's other meristematic cells, and they're located right here. Oh, it doesn't show them here.
No?
Doesn't show them in this picture.
Meristematic tissues produce most of a plant's new cells.
Video footage.
Most new plant cells are produced by cell divisions in regions of a plant called meristems. Meristematic cells continually divide. After each cell division, one of the two new cells remains meristematic, and the other cell begins to differentiate. Apical and lateral are two types of meristems that produce different cell types. Apical meristems produce cells that add length to stems and roots. Increases in stem and root lengths result from primary growth. Increases in root and stem diameters result from secondary growth. Secondary growth is produced by two types of lateral meristems. The vascular cambium is a thin cylinder of meristematic tissue that can run the entire length of roots and stems. The vascular cambium produces new transport cells in some roots and stems. In some plants, another lateral meristem, the cork cambium, produces cells that develop tough cell walls. These cells form a protective outside layer on stems and roots known as the cork tissue. Cork tissues make up the outer bark on a woody plant, like an oak tree.
Okay, it doesn't show it here well, but there is a ring of cells. You can see this green ring right here. There is a ring of cells in stems and roots that are constantly multiplying too, and that causes the outward growth of a plant. So plants grow up and down at the apical meristems, and they grow outward from a ring of cells that runs the entire length of the plant that's multiplying too. So the older a tree is, as a tree grows older, it grows outward, like this. The bigger a tree is, the older it is. These trees out here, these pine trees that you look at that are real tall and real wide, they're hundreds of years old. Oak trees can live 500–600 years.
What if they're really tall but they're thin?
Tall and thin means not as old. They grow up quickly tall, but it's really their thickness that'll tell you how old they are. Yeah?
Isn't if you cut a tree down, the rings inside like that?
Yes. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. The growth of this cambium differs in the season. In the spring it grows fast, and in the summer and winter it grows slower. So you see rings the way when the cells are laid out fast, they're light colored, and when the cells are laid out slow, they're dark colored. So you see rings when you cut it down. I'll show you that tomorrow when we talk about stem structure. So meristem tissue is just constantly dividing tissue. And you got that in cells to cause the growth. Primary growth is growth up and down. And secondary growth is growth outward.
How long do sequoias live?
How long does what?
Sequoias, those giant sequoias?
They can live up to 3,000 years. Old. Tomorrow I'll show you the oldest tree in the world. It's not a sequoia.
Wait, it's a gram tree.
Oh yeah, it's
What?
Okay, now you have dermal tissue. Have you ever heard, when I was a kid, we used to make fun of other kids by saying, your epidermis is showing.
No.
You ever heard that before?
Yes.
And the kid would go, no it's not. And you go, yes it is, it's showing. And they go, oh, and you embarrass them. Well, what we're talking about is dermal tissue. Dermal tissue is tissue on the surface. And if we take a look at surface tissue of cells, we've already studied a little bit the surface tissue. We have, for one thing, we have the cuticle. The cuticle is a waxy layer that the surface cells, the dermal tissue lays down the cuticle, which is a waxy covering. so water stays inside the plant. It's to keep water in. The epidermal cells do other things. Here we see a stoma, which is, again, it's the little thing that opens and closes to suction in oxygen, to suction in carbon dioxide and let out oxygen. This is my hand puppet. I call him Stomy.
Because he's like stoma.
Hello, Graham. I'm Stomy.
Yeah.
I did a little
Nice.
they call it.
Sounds good.
Hey there. I open and close to let in carbon dioxide.
Jeff Dunham of it.
Stomy.
Because he's a ventriloquist.
And that's exactly what stoma do. These cells right here on either side of the stoma are called guard cells. And what happens when they fill up with water, they expand, and that lets carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. So they open and close. If they were always open, the plant would dry up. It'd lose too much water. Plants got to be real careful not to dry out. Some types of dermal cells have trichomes. You see these little hairs? Have you ever seen a hairy leaf?
Yes.
The hairs on a leaf are called trichomes.
What are these things called lamb hairs and they're so soft?
Hairy leaves.
No, no,
And here's an up close look at the surface of a leaf that has those little hairs through an electron microscope. And you can see the hairs are for protection. They kind of keep insects and stuff off the surface. If things get too close to the surface, they can damage the plant, and so the hairs kind of protect the surface. A lot of plants have those trichomes. And then root hairs. If you look at the dermal cells of the root, you see little hairs sticking off the root, called root hairs. And they're for absorption. They add a lot of surface area to absorb. You ever seen the surface, look at the surface of a towel, like a bath towel? After you step out of the bathtub, you put it on a towel, it's hairy. It's got all these hairs sticking off of it. Why isn't it just flat and smooth? It'd be more absorbent if it's hairy, because each hair can absorb some water. So that's what the root hairs are for. The root hairs come out and absorb water.
What about ShamWow?
ShamWow. That's like magic. That's something totally different.
What about
Didn't that guy get put in jail?
What about an old-fashioned shame?
Okay, page 637 talks about the vascular tissue. Okay, we've done meristematic tissue and we've done dermal tissue. Dermal's the covering. Meristematic tissue are the cells that are constantly dividing. You need to be learning this now so you don't have to study it later. Next is vascular tissue. We've already talked about vascular tissue a little bit. Vascular tissue are the tissues in the plant that move water and food. And they're shaped like little tubes. This is called a vessel member. And a vessel member is an open tube. It's often cells that it's surrounded by cells that are parenchyma or sclerenchyma, tough cells usually. And these are open tubes that transport water. Water can move up and down these tubes. Often they have little plates at their ends that are shaped like a sewer grate or like the top of a salt shaker. You know, it has little holes in it. Separating the cells, they'll have, this shows a little grating that has little holes that the water can go through.
Is there a reason why the one in the middle is like diagonal?
Sometimes it's diagonal, sometimes it's straight. So the thick tubes are called vessel members. There are thinner tubes called tracheids, and this doesn't show it very well, but they're shaped sort of like carrots. They're tapered on the ends. So if I were to draw one, a tracheid would look like this. And it's got little holes right here. You filming this? Camera's not pointing at me.
Oh, I gotta go at you. That's how you want me to get this.
So, this is a tracheid, and there are little holes right here, and another tracheid will be right here, and the little holes connect the two. And so the water, this to transport water or other nutrients. And so the tracheids, so the water goes up through the tracheids like this. Tracheids don't transport water as fast as vessel members. But tracheids and vessel members make up what we call the xylem. Xylem are cells that transport water. So vascular tissue comes in two types. Xylem transports water. Do you know what the other type is called?
Xylem.
Not xylem.
Phloem.
Phloem.
Phloem. Oh, geez.
Phloem transports food, sugars.
Isn't that one of the eels things? Like a little lemon? Oh yeah, I watched that last night. I think it's like jets.
So let me show you some phloem cells.
It's probably
These are phloem cells. Phloem transports dissolved sugars and other organic compounds throughout the plant. The sugars that are made in the leaves are moved through the plant. They're dissolved in water, so it's like sugary water. It's like Kool-Aid. Do you know there's Kool-Aid running through plants?
No.
No.
Sugary water, yes there
I
is.
like plants so
The
much.
Kool-Aid runs through the phloem.
Yeah. Are the phloems or the tubes or?
Phloem are the tubes that transport the Kool-Aid.
So I can drink Kool-Aid from a plant stem.
Yeah, if you got cut into the phloem, and that's what they do when they take syrup from trees, from maple
I've done
trees.
that before.
The syrup is the phloem.
So wait, so you're saying phloem is a vascular
Wait, so
tissue?
you're saying Kool-Aid is syrup?
Phloem is a vascular tissue that transports water. It's not really Kool-Aid. I just said Kool-Aid because it's like Kool-Aid. It's
not
sugary
red.
water.
My life is a lie now.
So, this is what the phloem cells look like. The phloem cells consist of what we call sieve tube members
I'm funny.
and companion cells. A companion cell is a cell that attaches to a sieve tube member, and the sieve tube member is almost like one of those vessel cells, one of those vessels that we saw. These vessel members are very much like sieve tube members. They're very similar. There's a little plate on the bottom called the sieve plate that looks also like the top of a salt shaker. And the gooey, sugary fluid kind of moves down through these holes. The sieve plate. Have you ever heard the word sieve?
Yes, I
A
have.
sieve means something with holes in it. My Little League baseball coach used to tell me my glove was like a sieve.
At hockey games, they chant.
And see, I didn't know what he meant because I didn't know what a sieve was. And he was making fun of me, see? He'd say my glove is like a sieve. A sieve is something with holes in it. He's saying my glove had holes in it. He's like, hey, Willis, your glove's like a sieve. And I'd be like, oh yeah, it is a little bit, maybe like a sieve.
You had no idea what it
I
was.
didn't know until later.
At hockey
That's
games,
sad.
if like someone scores in the goalie a lot, they chant sieve.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
That's because no one watches hockey.
Hey Graham, how do you know that? Because I've been to hockey games.
Companion cell. A companion cell is the nucleated cell that helps the mature sieve tube member function in transporting dissolved substances in the phloem of vascular plants.
Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm pretty sure you said.
Okay,
You know something.
finally, the last type of tissue, ground tissue. So we've done meristematic tissue, those are cells that are dividing. What's the second one we did?
Dermal.
Dermal tissue, those are the coverings.
And then
What's the third one?
vascular tissue.
Vascular tissue, those are the transport cells, transport tissues. Finally, ground tissue consists of parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma cells. That all tissues consist of those cells. Functions in photosynthesis, storage, and support. Basically, ground tissue cells are filler cells. cells that make up the rest of the plant that's not vascular, it's not dermal, it's not meristematic. Any other cells are known as ground tissue cells. It's filler cells that fill up the rest of the plant. Often they store stuff. There's a bunch of cells in a root. If we were to cut open a root and look at it, we would see this. There's the epidermal cells on the outside. Then there's a bunch of cells that are just storage cells, these yellow ones. Those are ground tissue cells. Then there's multiplying cells. Those are the vascular, what's the word for the multiplying cells? The meristematic cells. So we got dermal cells, ground tissue, meristematic cells that are multiplying to increase the width, and then all of this is vascular tissue on the inside. Phloem cells are in blue, xylem cells are in red. Those are transport cells. So all the types are there, right there in the root. This is a root tip. If you took it, here's a long root. If you cut the root off and looked at the cells, you would see the 4 types of cells. Again, dermal covering, ground tissue cells taking up space and doing storage, multiplying cells, meristematic cells here,
Jellyfish.
and then vascular tissue cells.
We're done. Willis out.
We are done. Willis out.